nothing but the truth. There is now an ambition by 2047 to be a Viksit Bharat or a developed country.
When we really talk about what India needs to be from a developing perspective, we will have to be close to about $50,000 on PPP. On exchange rates, it'll be closer to about $20,000.
So let's keep it to this 2,400 that you said, which is about, I think, close to 2 lakh rupees. So we are now looking at, if we have to play catch up with the US and other countries, we have to boost our per capita 9 times.
We have to find a way that we are able to get more women to work and across the board. 669 districts contribute just about 15% of the GDP. So that there is this whole gap or a yawning thing that we are seeing, that there seems to be an economically dark set of areas or districts that are there, and we need to really focus on those districts as well moving forward. India into the percentile thing, if I'm dividing the whole population 100 into 100, then the top 10 people are just about 30,000 rupees per month.
Oh.
And that is where the thing is. And if you really go deeper, or if you go towards the back, you are seeing a huge levels of income drop that happens. In fact, the top 10% of India makes close to about a similar amount of money, close to about 40% of the bottom 40%.
Wow.
And this actually makes things very, very worrying.
Hello, I'm Raj Chengappa of India Today and your host for Nothing But the Truth. Every week, we will analyze key issues of concern and give you perspectives and clarity as to why these matter to you without holding back on the truth. In his first Independence Day address after being re-elected for the third consecutive time, Prime Minister Narendra Modi reiterated his commitment for a Viksit Bharat or a developed India by 2047. Now, after completing 77 years of freedom, how far are we away from this target? What does India and we all as citizens of this great country have to do to ensure that we become a global giant? A giant that delivers inclusive growth and prosperity to all. So in this episode, let's analyze what it will take us to get there. To help us do so, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Amit Kapoor, who's Honorary Chairman of the Institute of Competitiveness in Gurgaon, as well as faculty at the Stanford University in the US. So welcome to Nothing But the Truth, Amit Kapoor.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Raji.
Thank you. And let us begin at looking at what is the definition of a developed country. There is now an ambition by 2047 to be a Viksit Bharat or a developed country. What is the key dashboard item, would you say, that defines a developed country?
Oh, so one of the most pertinent things in terms of understanding what a developing country would be is GDP per capita. And the other one is going to be the social progress that we are able to achieve, because there are two dimensions that we have to understand from a growth perspective. One is economic progress and the other one being social progress.
Right.
On economic progress, we have to be something close to about $18,000 to really go beyond the middle income point.
So if we translate that to rupees, that will be about rupees 17 lakhs a year, am I right?
In today's terms, yes.
Right, okay. 17 lakhs a year is what you would say that someone in the developed country would be getting per annum. Am I right?
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
And when you look at India, what is the per capita income that we're looking at?
So there are two measures. Like if you really look at the exchange rate per se, we are just very low at about $2,400 at this point in time. On PPP, we are close to about 6,500. But when we really talk about what India needs to be from a developing perspective, we will have to be close to about $50,000 on PPP. On exchange rates, it'll be closer to about $20,000.
So let's keep it to this 2,400 that you said, which is about, I think, close to 2 lakh rupees. So we are now looking at, if we have to play catch up with the US and other countries, we have to boost our per capita 9 times to get to something like 17 lakh rupees per annum per person. Am I right? That's the figure, that's the challenge.
Absolutely. That's one of the biggest challenges that we have. For that, we will have to do multiple set of things.
But before I come to that, let us just do a comparison with other countries, okay, which are parallel to India. Where would you say China, Brazil, Vietnam, and other countries would be, so that we get a sense of not only do we have to overtake them, but also reach the US and the other European countries that are developed?
Oh, so if you really look at the cohort of the developing world, if you talk about Brazil, Brazil is close to about $11,300 at this point in time. China is close to about 13,200.
Right.
Vietnam is close to about 4,600. South Africa is close to about $6,000. And that's the BRIC economies that we are really talking about. And
And can I
so
just interrupt you? I think Bangladesh is slightly ahead of us in terms of per capita income. Since it's in the
absolutely.
news, I'm talking about it.
Definitely. In
Yes.
fact, that is one of the biggest challenges that we will have to surmount.
Right. So if you look, that is the, in terms of the others, what is the reason why we seem to have such a low per capita income and yet a high growth that we have seen? India is one of the fastest growing major economies at the moment, riding at about 8%. What is the reason why we are so low in our per capita income?
So, there are two things which are defining why we are so low on the per capita income. One is, of course, what we would call as the GDP per person or per employee,
Right.
which is fairly minimal right now. The second one is the employment share. So we are talking about two distinct issues here. The labor force participation, which tends to be fairly low. We are just at about 50% right now.
Okay.
And then if you really talk about the GDP per employee, that is also very, very low at this point in time. So if we have to really talk about India's per capita income being low, it is about labor force participation and the labor productivity, which is effectively facing a lot of issues. We have grown over a period of time. We've had sustained prosperity. Yes, we have grown at 8%. But then what is happening is that it is not really getting translated at what you call income levels increasing at the lower end of the base. We are seeing a lot of wealth creation at the top, but we are not seeing what you call income distribution happening at the bottom end of the spectrum.
Let me just sort of simplify it for our readers. When you say a labor participation rate, you will say that as a percentage of the total working age population, we are only 50% of our people are employed in the formal sector. Would you be largely talking, or includes the informal sector?
That should include the informal sector. If you really look at the Government of India statistics, that include the informal sector. So we are at about 53% right
And
now.
whereas other countries like the US, China, what is the percentage that they normally have in terms of the labor force getting it?
Also, US is fairly high right now. US is close to about 90%. If you really talk about China, China is close to about 64% on labor force participation. So they have a significant higher level of labor force participation across the board. And that has actually been the defining movement. If you dig deeper into this,
Right.
one of the biggest things that is happening on the labor force participation rate in India is that the low participation from women. We are just at about 30%, and we saw some significant gains in the last 10 years. We moved from close to about 18% to 35%. But then we have to go far beyond that. And like this 35% that we are really talking about, a lot of people or a lot of academics are saying that it was because of the distress that was caused by COVID. So people started working at that point in time. So there is a lot of distress
Right.
based employment that has got there, or people have started working. But we have to find a way that we are able to get more women to work and across the board. And this whole labor force participation is a thing which has a huge spatial connotation. When I say spatial connotation, in terms of it has variations
Right.
across the country as well, and across states.
And if you take a look at, one of the things you mentioned, of course, very, very importantly, is the female participation. And that you're saying is improved, but largely distress improvement from, say, 18% to around 30%, largely because of COVID. People had to go back to work, but that is a very, very low percentage. Even then, it is much lower than what we see internationally in other countries that we are competing with. But let us also look at the distribution of per capita income. Now, we talked of $2,400 per annum. Is that across all the states, or there are states that are very, very low in terms of their per capita income, which we really have to play catch up? First, get those states before we can push the rest of the country up as well.
Raji, this is one of the most important things that we have to really understand from an India perspective. 2400 is what we are talking about pan India. The moment I actually dig deeper, this is where the aberrations in the system start becoming very apparent. If you really look at, say, Bihar is just at about 420 odd dollars right
Right.
now. And if Bihar is a country, then it is the lowest per capita in the world. Incidentally, Bihar actually has a per capita income which is lower than Sudan right now.
Right.
And so on that peg, we are the lowest on Bihar. UP is close to about $650. That means like UP is also having a significant issue. In these two states, become very important for a simple reason that they have 25% of India's population. But if you go beyond that, then there are places like Maharashtra, which has a higher per capita income. If you really talk about Goa, they have higher per capita income. Goa gets close to about 300,000 rupees, which roughly translates to about $4,000 at this point in time.
Right.
So you will see a huge level of spatial differences. But the moment you dig into it, like if I talk about Maharashtra as well, now Maharashtra would be close to about 250,000 rupees. But the moment you dig deeper into Maharashtra, you will end up seeing that you have one of the most prosperous cities in the world, in Maharashtra and even in India. Like, say, if you really talk about Bombay, but then out of the 17% of GDP that Maharashtra contributes to India, 90% of it is coming from 10 centers within Maharashtra itself. So
Right.
the moment you start looking at the geographical distribution, you find that there is a huge, what I call spatial differences that exist. Let me give you a very interesting fact on the spatial part
Right.
of it as well. From a GDP contribution point of view, the
Uh-huh.
top 100 districts in India contribute close to about 85% of India's
Wow.
GDP. And then you're suddenly talking about 769 districts that India has. 669 districts contribute just about 15% of the GDP. So there is this whole gap or a yawning thing that we are seeing, that there seems to be an economically dark set of areas or
Mm-hmm.
districts that are there, and we need to really focus on those districts as well moving forward. Because if we are not able to create opportunities in those districts,
Right.
there are going to be challenges that we see.
Right.
And this is also getting reflected in the numbers that we are having from, say, the support mechanism that the government of India gives. 80 crore people, close to about 81 crore people, and that is from the government of India statistics, get free food.
Right.
So that means there is a certain economic challenge that we are facing in those set of districts, because that is where the predominant set of people who are not getting employed or who do not have adequate income stay.
Right. No, and that's a very good point you make because, 80 crore people is the world's largest welfare program that is being run. Second point that you made in terms of the fact of employment and the fact that people are taking these welfare measures means that they either underemployed or poorly employed. And the third point, I think, which is very important that you made was, and I can give an example. I grew up in Bangalore, or Bengaluru as it is known now. And if you take a look at the GDP of Bangalore city versus if you compare it with Karnataka, you will find that it dominates like something like 33% of the GDP comes alone from one particular city of that whole state. So it's a very good point, but I want to touch another aspect of it, which is when you look at incomes. And you take a look at what the taxpayers are at the moment, and what is it if you look across at incomes, what percentage of the working group contribute how much? Then we'll just like you're talking of disparity in districts. Can you analyze for us in terms of incomes? What is the top percentile that is getting the money versus those that are not earning enough for it?
Oh, so like we did this whole body of work on income inequality in India, and we had done it with the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. And we just published that report in 22, and that gave us some very startling figures. If you are earning close to about 25,000 rupees, and that was 2022 figure, we have updated
Right.
that, you are in top 10% of the Indian income group. If you make today's figure is 30,000 rupees per month, and that means you are in the top 10% of the Indian economy. And if
And
you
what do you
really
mean by the
discern it,
top 10%? I mean, when you say that,
so
what
if
is, yeah,
when you say top 10% of the income spectrum, like, so if you really talk about India into the percentile thing,
right.
if I'm dividing the whole population 100 into 100, then the top 10 people are just about 30,000 rupees per month.
Oh,
And that is where the thing is. And if you really go deeper, or
right.
if you go towards the back, you are seeing a huge levels of income drop that happens. In fact, the top 10% of India makes close to about a similar amount of money, close to about 40% of the bottom 40%.
Wow.
And this actually makes things very, very worrying, because what is going to happen is that if I'm not able to increase the income levels for all the people across the board,
Right.
you would see some what I call yawning gaps that will start appearing on the income levels.
Which is
And
what
this is
we're talking about, the K-shaped growth, that a certain section benefits quite enormously by the growth, but a whole vast numbers don't really get the kind of income that they should be getting. Am I right? Is that the sort of way you look at it?
Yes, so we are seeing that. If you really look at this whole idea that the trickle down effect would have actually happened, it is not really translating into that kind of a situation right now. The trickle down is something which is still waiting for to happen. It'll take many years, but I think rather than the trickle down thing, what we are saying is that we need to dig deeper and understand that we will have to create opportunities across the board in different sets of districts and different set of states. Right now, the top six states contribute close to about 80% of India's GDP. So that means there are those states which is hardly contributing to the Indian GDP
And can
itself.
you give us an idea of these top six states off the top of your head?
So it is Maharashtra, Gujarat, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Andhra. So these are the biggest states
Right.
that we are talking about.
Right. Interesting. And now let's move to the other aspect that you talked about. But before I come to the social side of it, let us look at GDP. Currently, we are at about 7 to 8% average GDP. As I said earlier, one of the fastest growing major economies in the world. And yet, if we have to touch the numbers that we have to do in terms of per capita that you talked about, $18,000 per annum, what is the kind of percentage of growth we must be propelling in the next 2 decades before we hit 2047? What is that rate and what do we need to get there?
Oh, so like we are talking about a growth rate of or a sustained growth of at least 9.5 to 10%.
Right.
If we want to achieve the target of what we really have set out to be. So if India wants to be a $30 trillion economy, then we are talking about that levels of growth rate. And how do I really get there?
Right.
So the kind of challenges that we are really talking about right now. So what are the challenges here for India? I say that there are four challenges that India actually faces. Like one is, of course, the shared prosperity challenge that we have really talked about, income distribution. The second is the job challenge.
Right.
How do we create the effective opportunities, which has the quality of jobs that we have to look at? The third thing is the policy implementation challenge. India faces a huge policy implementation deficit. I think there is no dearth of ideas. When the Prime Minister says that we want to achieve Viksit Bharat, I think his heart is in the right place. The problem or the challenge that he faces is how do we implement across the different set of states? And we are facing that implementation deficit. And the last but not the least is the kind of a global winds of change that we are seeing. So there is this
Right.
whole technological change that is happening. The globe is becoming fairly a difficult place to maneuver in terms of how the security situation is moving. So we might actually even face headwinds. And India has been facing headwinds. So I do appreciate the growth rates that we are seeing, even with the headwinds that we have faced post 2018, post because of COVID, because of the Ukraine war, the Israel-Hamas crisis. But we have to look at about 10%. And then the next thing is going to happen. We do not know how the global crisis is going to pan out. We do not know how what I call technology is going to really shape up things. Technology is going to be one of the biggest
Right.
things. So India has to be what I call look at those opportunities and prepare our people for it. So the big challenge
Yeah.
here from a job perspective, like a lot of people don't talk about it, we really try to shove it under the carpet, is like what is going to happen to our demographic dividend? India today faces a very serious challenge from a demographic dividend point of view. We are young, without a doubt, but are we preparing our young for the future? We have been talking about the same set of issues for the last 25 to 30 years,
Right.
but we have not really worked towards it. We do have a new education policy, which is the heart is at the right place, but we are not doing enough. Let me just share a number here,
Sure.
which is a very startling number. There is this and what do you call the report that the government of India also does, which is the National Assessment Survey, which in itself says that 60% of the kids who go into class 8 are not able to read and write for what is being taught in class 2.
Wow.
ASER says this number is much higher, but what we are saying here is that we are not preparing our kids for the future, because if they're not able to read and write, how do I skill them?
Right.
How do I actually take them to higher education? Let me give you an example here. Like there is this, each one of us in India has domestic help. There is this young lady who works with us. She's a graduate and she's a graduate in biology, but she's not able to get any other job in the market. So she works as domestic help.
Right.
And that is one of
That's
the
a very
biggest.
common story across this country. I mean, and if you look at the number of government jobs that are there, and if you look at the number of applications, you understand that there is a phenomenon. I mean, just in Maharashtra recently, I think there was something like for 1,000 posts, there were 2 lakh applicants coming in for a police post or something like that. So you can see the shortage of opportunities in that sense.
No, so if you really look at what's happening in UP, UP has just advertised 60,000 police what I call openings, and for that, close to about 47 lakh people have applied.
Wow.
The exam's just happening in the next 2 weeks. So for 60,000 openings, we are talking about close to about 45 to 50 lakh people applying. that means there is a severe challenge. Of course, there is a mindset issue that everybody wants to get into a
Correct.
sarkari job.
Right.
They are not really wanting to get into the private sector. But there are issues and challenges in terms of job creation that we are seeing right now.
And let's then, drill that down into the economic side of it, where we are looking at looking at the key sectors that are there, whether we're looking at agriculture, whether we're looking at services, and we're looking at manufacturing industry. Now, let me just look at manufacturing, because we have seen phenomenal growth in terms of services. As I said, I come from Bengaluru, and one of the great contributors of Bangalore is that the IT industry that has really boosted our entire, in terms of services, the productivity that is there. But manufacturing, now here we find that normally you would see as a country develops, the percentage of people employed in agriculture will start dropping and manufacturing and services will increase. But here we find that manufacturing has actually declined in terms of percentage contribution from 18% to, I think the current figure is 13%. What is the problem? And I mean, you've studied competitiveness. What do we need to do to boost that? Or do we, as Raghuram Rajan says, that you can bypass it and go directly towards services and get the kind of jobs and income that you need?
No, so on this point, I'll disagree with Raghu. Like in terms of saying that when he says that you will have to bypass what you call manufacturing. Look at the vast set of population that we are really talking about, and how do we really make sure that we are able to employ them? Because even if you really talk about services, like there is only so much that we are able to do on services, because there is another challenge of services, which I'll come to later. But from a manufacturing viewpoint, like we have actually dipped over a period of time. Right now, we're just about close to 14% of GDP from manufacturing, which has gone down from about 18%. And what is the reason for it? I think what is happening is that one, we have not been able to create the right ecosystem for the manufacturing space. So the challenge here is that we have not been able to cross that barrier of that middle gap that we have. When you talk about the enterprises, we just don't have those mid-size enterprises, and that is where we are missing the element. We have
The
not
missing
been
middle,
able
you
to.
call it. That's the word that
Yes,
you use, I think,
exactly.
quite
The missing
frequently.
middle. Yeah, the
Yes.
missing middle is what we are really talking about. We have not, either we are just way too small, or we have those large enterprises. The missing middle is just there. We have not been able to push forward with that. We have not had the adequate labor reforms. We have done something, but far more needs to be done. So if we don't do that, we are still going to be fixated on that missing middle problem. We have been talking about this problem for the number of decades, but we have not gone there. The other thing is,
Yeah.
in terms of creation of clusters for manufacturing, we do see some great pockets of excellence that India has seen. Like you have Chennai area, the Sriperumbudur belt. If you talk about Pune, Chinchwad area, Aurangabad has done something. You have Manesar here, you have Gujarat, Sanand, and things which have got created. But far more needs to be done. We need to go to the local levels. We need to create those manufacturing enterprises there. We need to support those manufacturing enterprises. Just a very simple point. Haryana and Punjab should have been the food processing hubs in this country.
Right.
But we have not been able to create those because the local laws are so archaic that we have just not been able to create the food processing industry. So it's not only the central government which has to do things, it's the state governments which will have to do so many things. Today, what we see is there is this whole huge dissonance between what the states do and what the center actually wants to do. The center, I think, is far more progressive than the state governments or many state governments that we see within the country right now.
Right. No, and that's a good point that you're making in terms of manufacturing. I recall one of the things you had also mentioned was that if you take a look at when we talk of the so-called MSME sector, 90% of the people and the labor and the units are all in this micro units rather than in the other side, the medium and maybe small. But really what you're saying is that we need to move to the medium. You need to scale up phenomenally. Am I right? Is that where you're headed to?
Absolutely. If we don't do that, where is the employment generation going to happen? In fact, when you talk about services as well, we are already seeing that there is a certain level of shrink within the IT sector because there is this whole huge realignment across the globe. There is another challenge that we are facing within that space is that we are seeing huge set of shifts from a skill requirement perspective. We are not a very skilled country right now.
Right.
A lot of us will not like my saying it, but the fact is that India is a low-skilled country.
What is the percentages? Can you tell us in terms of your estimates of skill levels that is there?
Oh, so that's not my estimate. That is effectively the estimate of the government of India. That comes from the PLFS data itself.
That's your
So if you
periodic
really
labor
look at
force surveys.
yes, so
Yes.
the PLFS data gives me some very interesting figures. 67% of the workforce that we are really talking about is semi-skilled workers right now. Only about what do you call 4% of 4.1% of India is a highly skilled set of people. So that is where we have to really see how do we create these things of skilled people. So sorry, let me get the figure right. 22% of the workforce is at skill level 1. Skill level 2 and 3 is 67%. And then the rest is the high level skills. So that
Right.
is what we have to really get right. We
When you say
have to
skill level 1, it is the lowest level. Am I right?
exactly
Yeah.
the skill level 1 is the lowest level. That is where we are
Very
talking about
basic stuff. Agriculture,
very
labor, and
basic things.
yeah.
Exactly. So
Right.
it is only at the skill level 3 and skill level 4 when you are in a position to extract more value from your labor. That is when they will actually get high paying jobs.
Right.
Just a figure here, if you really look at
Sure.
the numbers, and this is, we did I did the study for on the India data, and we find something very interesting. For every one additional year of education, you start earning 8,000 rupees more per annum.
Wow.
That means education becomes very important.
Right.
And then beyond that, skilling also becomes exceedingly important. And we have to bridge those things right away. And we
Right.
are not doing it. Look at the gross enrollment ratios, which have actually, which are not adequate enough. We need to
Right.
go there as well.
When you say gross enrollment ratio, I would gather that you're talking of people who are moving from secondary to high school to college, and that ratio is extremely low. While we have done well in primary by almost 100%, as we get to secondary, it drops to about 70%. As we get to high school, it's 50%, and by the time we get to college, it's 30%. I think that's the rough figure. Only
Exactly.
about 1 out of 3 people who pass out of high school actually get into college. But if you look at 1 out of 2 people drop out at high school. So you're really getting a very small number when that goes to higher education or skilled education or whatever it is. Am I right? That's the sort of
Absolutely.
scenario that you're
Absolutely.
looking at.
Absolutely. On the higher education as well, when you talk about graduates as well, they're not getting the adequate training as well. We need to revamp our education on a war footing. Today, if India needs to get things right, I do agree that India should become and will become one of the large economies in the future. But to get things right, the primary focus will have to be education. If
Right.
we don't get our education right, we are going to be facing a sort of crisis in the future.
Now, one quick point, you dealt with the manufacturing, we dealt with the services sector and the restrictions and the constrictions because of skill levels that, there's a tapering off. You boomed a lot, but now you have to really up your skilling to get the kind of opportunities that are being opened up now for them. Agriculture, if you look at it. Now, one of the things that we are doing is that because of the what we call the grain addiction, where we produce a hell of a lot of amount of grain because it's the MSP minimum support prices are there, farmers feel comfortable and secure. We haven't really diversified to what they call horticulture, fisheries, and marine products apart from dairy. Now, one of the issues is that in horticulture, you actually contribute in terms of it's high value but high risk. Despite the fact that horticulture might only account for 30% of the production, it might give you 50% of the actual income that you're getting, but you're unable to shift decisively towards that. What in your experience, when you looked at countries and you studied competitiveness across countries, how did they get across that shift, dramatic shift that you see to high value agriculture products and begin to taper off on the others?
So, this is a very interesting trajectory that we have to look at. And this is, so when you talk about moving from agriculture to something else
Right.
or a higher value added agricultural things, we have to understand that we are focused or we think of things in a very wrong way at points in time. India somehow, like from a policy perspective, we started believing that innovation is only IT. We
Right.
did not understand that innovation happens within the agricultural space as well.
Right.
We did not
Very good
understand that
point.
high value added items can actually happen in the agricultural
And you
space.
talked of that food processing, yes.
Absolutely. So we
Yeah.
never looked at that. And what happened is that there was this whole huge gross level of subsidization that we were doing for the farmers. We have done that. If you really look at Punjab itself or Haryana itself, we subsidize the farmer to the greatest possible extent, free
Right.
water, free electricity, and whatever. And it becomes a lot easier for them to go into those products. So they were never given that learning. They were never given the incentive to move up the scale. They were
Except,
never
let
given
us
the
just give
knowledge.
an exception that during Green Revolution, they were the pioneers. When they saw the
Yes, absolutely.
opportunity, it boomed, right? And they were the best and continued to be the best farmers in terms. But when that reached saturation point, there was no shift. Am I right? That's
Yes,
what we're saying.
exactly. So we have
Yeah,
not shifted, like because grain is something which happened after the 1960s, and
correct.
we are talking about something that happened 50, 60 years back. Now we have to change again. We will have to create those incentives for the farmers to really go into a different set of spectrum. And this also is an important point because like if we have to improve productivity in the farming sector, one, we have to really make sure that 45% of the people who work in the farming space or the agricultural space, they will start leaving and the productivity will rise. That means smaller number of people, the larger set of people move out of agriculture. That is very important for the country. But for that, we will have to talk about newer set of measures, newer set of incentive structures, newer ways of looking at how the markets operate. If we are
Right.
not doing that, if we are not incentivizing the complete value chain of agriculture, we are not setting it right, we will not get things at the right spectrum.
Which is a very good point that you make in the sense that, if you look at what you said, 45% of the people, laborers employed in agriculture, but deliver only 17% of the total GDP in terms of value. And that has to change because you are putting too many people and getting less productivity of it. But you also make a significant point when we talk of factors of productivity or the economy, whether it's labor, land, capital, and entrepreneurship. You have actually moved away from that and said the real emphasis should be on innovation. You talked of that word, that it should not just be factor driven, but innovation driven. Now, what is the difference that you see when you look at the nations competing? What is that decisive difference it makes?
Well, so this takes us to a very important point in terms of how economies grow or how nations grow. So there are three stages of growth that will happen. So one
Right.
is of course what you call as factor-driven stage, wherein your per capita incomes would be low. As at an aggregate level, India is still at a factor-driven stage. If you really, but you will always have pockets of excellence anywhere. The second stage is what you call as efficiency-driven or manufacturing-driven. The third is going to be innovation-driven. But like when you talk about innovation-driven, innovation can happen across the sectors. When you talk about a country like Israel, Israel is a great example of understanding how agriculture could become such a huge, stunning success for them.
Right.
They created drip irrigation. They live in a very, very difficult area. It's a sandy place or it's a desert. And even then, they have been able to do so many things. We should do that. In fact, this leads us to an important thing is there something called as low tech or high tech sectors? No, there is nothing called as low tech or high tech sectors. There is something called as low tech and high tech firms. In
Right.
India, what you talk about, we celebrate enterprises like Infosys, but Infosys is a low-tech company. It's not a high-tech company because it is about labor arbitrage. It's not anything else. So even the IT sector in India has been low-tech because it was about labor arbitrage. It was not about anything else.
Right.
We have not created products. We should start looking. Finacle was, of course, created by Infosys, not to take it away from them, but there is far more that needs to be done.
And that's a good
So
question to ask. Why don't we produce, the Googles, the Facebooks, the other big social media companies? We're no more in that picture. We do have some sort of replications for Amazon and the others. But why doesn't India, when you talk of the innovation index, I gather we are pretty low down on that innovation index. And why don't we produce the kind of that excellence that takes us beyond what you say, this low-tech labor arbitrage that you talk about?
So, like one is, of course, the ecosystem. Like there are cultural factors to it, like how many of us can be risk takers, how many of us can be entrepreneurs, what's the cost of failure that exists within the country. The cost of failure is very high. We look, as a society, we look down on people who fail. We do not want to support them. There is no social security that exists. Today, as an entrepreneur, if I go into the market and be an entrepreneur and I fail, what is it that I have as a backup system? There is
Right.
nothing that is available. Yeah, the second thing is in terms of like what is happening within our institutions itself. When you talk about the institutions within the country, how many IITs or IIMs or whatever are producing what you would call as entrepreneurs? They're effectively glorified placement exchanges right now.
Right.
Sorry for saying that word, but then what is happening within the IIMs is that you're employing people or their placement exchanges. They get there, the brightest of the people get there, and they just find jobs. They're not really being entrepreneurs themselves. Why
Right.
can't we say that 50% of the kids can actually be entrepreneurs from that place? And that is also an important thing in terms of the numbers. Like I just recently visited University of California, San Diego, and found out that their incubation center has a budget of $1.8 billion a year.
Wow.
That's a bloody significant amount.
True.
What is it that we are really doing? We are not really talking about those numbers. In fact, India's higher education budget for this year is close to about $5 billion, which is about 45,000 to 50,000 crore rupees. The budget for UCSD is close to about $10 billion. The Stanford's budget for this year is $19 billion. So we are talking about a very different realm wherein we are able to create or what you call possibilities. We should really push forward wherein we say that the PhDs that we are producing, let them be enterprise creators as well. Today, if you really look at the US, most of the PhD students are going out and becoming enterprise creators. We
Right.
can do that in India. Let's incentivize our people. They're smart enough. It is nothing's wrong with our education system per se in terms of what they're learning. The
Right.
thing is that we are not able to really push them forward into a certain direction. Everybody, even today for that matter, desires or wants to live outside. India is the only country, like 94% of the Indians who go out to US to study, they don't come back.
Right. Which is and when one of the figures that you had quoted in one of your pieces recently was that you talked of the innovation index, and we are ranked 140 out of the 132 countries surveyed, which is a stunning figure. But if you take a look, R&D, which is very, very critical, and if you're talking of the American system where the universities actually drive a lot of R&D that's there, and since the Olympics just concluded, the largest amount of medal winners actually came from a university system of athletic training. Now, this is something that when we talked about higher education, and leave that for a moment, we talked a lot on education. When you take a look at R&D, and one of the things is that it's largely central government funding and less of state government and private funding. Am I right?
Oh, without a doubt. Even today, if you really look at it, like close to about 50% of the R&D spends in the country are coming from the government of India.
Right.
The private sector is just what do you call investing close to about 30% of the total R&D expenses.
Right.
So somewhere I think there's that missing point that we are not really moving towards investing in R&D. The enterprises don't really see any incentive to incentivize or to do R&D. I think that is also have a huge policy perspective from the past as to how India grew over the past few decades.
Right.
The incentivization for R&D has just not been there. If we really understand, the corporate sector will have to understand that to create newer solutions will mean that we can extract more wealth is the key. We have not been able to do that. As corporations, what we see is that the commoditization of products happens very quickly within the country. We are not extracting more and more value out of it.
I know this is a big subject, and there are a lot more things we could have discussed, but I think you've highlighted a lot of the issues that were there. We could have, of course, touched on the fact that if you look at the four engines of the economy, the capital expenditure of the government is really picked up, and that's what has pulled us out of the rut of COVID. Private investment is still not firing as much as it should, despite the fact that they got a very good bonus in terms of the corporate taxes being reduced substantially. If you take a look at consumption expenditure, we have seen an uptick, but again, the kind of things that we need to do to get the kind of economy going still is a long way. And the final part, of course, is exports, where we really need to beef up things over there. We hit a high strap, but kind of stagnated, and this is where we need to rethink. So apart from the points that you have said, very, very insightful comments and analysis that you made. So Amit Kapoor, thank you very much for taking time out to speak to me.
Thank you. It's absolutely been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for being with me in this episode of Nothing But the Truth for an in-depth analysis of this particular topic that we picked up, how India could become a global giant. To read the latest issue of India Today, which not only has an article by Amit Kapoor, but has over 28 essays that looks at this precise issue. It is something that you should read. It is a collector's issue. It's an Independence Day special. I look forward to having you with me next week. Nothing but the truth.